And as he said, yes, we have half a dozen loyal tour friends here in Holland now. I'm looking over the list of those that went on my tour in September. I see Harold and Anita. Are they here tonight? Yeah, they're here without crutches, without wheelchair, without any mechanical assistant. Boy, Anita was quite a trooper, I'll tell you. John and Joyce, are they here? Not yet? Okay, they also went. Randy and Elaine are here, okay? So talk to them about the tour. I think they can tell you they were well fed. Nobody lost weight. We had delightful economy motels so that we could sleep well. We learned a lot on the road, saw a lot, and came back in one piece. So we're grateful for those that went along. We are thinking again of another tour in 2020. Do these about every 2 years. If you will lay aside $10 every week over the next 2 years, you'll have more than enough, okay, to go. We are thinking about a Michigan Adventist history tour next time. There are a lot of historic places in south central Michigan, and also up to the north, Petoskey area as well, the grave of Hannah More. And since we usually combine Adventist history with Adventist history, you know, we can go up there to the Straits of the Mackinac. We can see the Grand Hotel. I don't know if we can afford to stay there for a night or not, but we can see it. We can see the locks, right? We can see the Sioux locks. We can get some fudge up there. And so that's a possibility. Petoskey area is very beautiful. Some of you can get some Petoskey stones and bring them back. So Jesse Landis, his wife Susan, and I are thinking about that as a possibility, and that would certainly be cheaper as well. You know, we were at $9.95 a piece for the tour of New England, and we could probably do it for considerably less here in Michigan. So do keep that in mind. Begin to set the funds aside, and we'll give you more details as we get closer to that time. Now we're doing Stephen Haskell. We've done 2 already, parts 1 and 2, and I'll briefly review those since it's been several months since I've been here. And then I brought the Haskell biography, which has photographs. Okay, you want to pass that around. At the back, where the paper clip is, it has photographs that some of you may want to look at as well. All right, part 1, 1833 to 1876, we learned that Stephen Haskell was born in Oakham, Massachusetts in 1833 or 1834. The records are not too clear on that date. Health problems prevented him from completing elementary school, but he was a voracious reader and acquired a library worth $2,000 by the time he was a teenager. He taught himself logic. He taught himself to improve his sentence structure by studying algebra. You remember how you loved that in school? Algebra. He could X, Y, and Z did not fascinate Jim. Okay. Amen. He could plow fields. He could build bridges. He could drain land. He could erect fences. We saw a picture of the Haskell that he invented, a lever mounted on wheels to pull up tent stakes quickly and easily, called the Haskell. He sold soap door to door, reading his Bible as he went. And we learned that he read his Bible through 73 times. Some of you are falling a little bit behind on that, all right? 73 times. In the 1840s, he joined his parents' church, the Congregational Church, but in 1850, he converted to Methodism. He became a Methodist exhorter and then a preacher in New England. We also learned, to our surprise, that in 1851, when he was only 17, he married Mary Howe, an invalid who was 38. his age, because her brother begged him to marry Mary and take care of her as an invalid. He did such a good job, she lived on into her 70s. He converted to Seventh-day Adventism. Joseph Bates, 1854, became a very, very strict vegetarian. We'll talk some more about that in part 3. He was rebuked by Ellen White, however, for making pork a test of fellowship. In the early period there, before she had her health reform vision, there were those who felt that pork should be a test of fellowship, but she had received no vision about that subject as yet. He could be narrow-minded and rigid, rather judgmental, but we learned he could also be very principled and courageous, sincere, zealous for the truth. Haskell accepted Ellen White's testimonies that came to him, and he became one of her leading defenders throughout his life. He raised up a church in South Lancaster, Massachusetts, and created report blanks to show progress in the cause. He was ordained in 1868, became president of the New England Conference in 1870, and served one of the longest periods in conference leadership, 1870 to 1887. He vigorously promoted the publishing work. We talked about the Vigilant Missionary Society that his wife and 5 other ladies had founded, the Tract Missionary Societies in New England, New York, and finally the General Conference level. And we closed part 1 by pointing out how everybody wanted Haskell on their board. He served on the General Conference Committee, the Publishing Association, the Health Reform Institute Board, and president of the General Tract Missionary Society, and started the ship ministry at ports along our eastern coast of the United States. So that was part 1. Part 2, last April, 1876 to 94, we saw that Elder Haskell was appointed to other leadership positions as well, the Review and Herald Publishing Company, president of the New England and California conferences. Now think about that geography. There's no airplanes. He's got to get back and forth by train, from New England to California. And he was president of the 2 conferences from 1879 to 1887. Stephen and Mary Haskell founded the New England School in South Lancaster in 1882. They had 19 students, 3 teachers. Boys farmed, girls worked in the cafeteria and the laundry. And in 1883, this school was named South Lancaster Academy. The academy is still going. Atlantic Union College, of course, has closed for good. Haskell promoted the ministerial institutes for pastors and Bible teachers across New England. He assisted Dudley Canright, James White, John Andrews, and Uriah Smith in promoting the new tithing plan in 1878. That was tithing the income rather than tithing the increase from one year to the next. In 1879, he preached at camp meetings in California and Oregon. 1882, we found he spent 6 months in Europe, England, France, Switzerland, Norway, Netherlands, Germany, and Italy, and organized tract societies, the publishing work, and attended the first European Council that was founded in Europe. Ellen White sent Haskell a testimony urging him to be kinder, more cheerful, and gentler with his students. He was a New Englander. He could be a bit dour, a bit on the sour side. Took himself a little too seriously, I think, sometimes. So she said, be kinder, be cheerful, be more gentle. In 1884, Haskell was elected president of the Maine Conference. He also popularized the new Bible reading format of Bible study, which was later published as Bible Readings for the Home Circle. Some of you are old enough, gray enough to remember Bible Readings. I'll bring you an original copy next time. In fact, I'll bring you several original copies of Haskell's books next time when we talk about Haskell as a writer In 1885, the General Conference sent him to Australia and New Zealand to start a new printing press and a new paper called the Bible Echo. He also had an interesting hobby. He put Adventist tracts inside of beer bottles and wine bottles that he found along the way and threw them into the ocean. He prayed over them, that God would guide in their journey across the sea to someone, somewhere that would appreciate it. What a hobby. In 1887, the General Conference sent him to Europe again, and he attended several camp meetings, the European Council, and started a new school in England, which today is Newbold College. I had the privilege of teaching there in 1990. I got to get out of the 20th century for me here. 1990. Whoops! And he chaired some important General Conference sessions, including the one at Minneapolis. He was there for that very contentious Righteousness by Faith conference. In 1889 and 91, he and his friend Percy McGann, once again, did a round-the-world tour. You know, he's pushing 60 at this point. They visited England, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Portugal, South Africa, Australia, India, China, and Japan. Makes me tired just thinking about it. And Anita is yawning with the weariness of the thought of going to all those places. He promoted work among the Hindus, the Sikhs, the Buddhists, the Confucians. First time he's ever been dealing with non-Christian cultures. Between 1891 and 94, he was elected president of the California Conference again. And at that time, California Conference included Nevada, Utah, and Arizona as well. And then we closed on a rather sad note, I think, part two. Mary's death. She died of a stroke at the age of 80 in 1894. But then he returned to Europe and South Africa for some more preaching tours. So that brings us to part three today, 1894 to 1905, as we talk about Haskell's ministry in the church during his 60s and 70s. He's not going to retire. Kind of like J.N. Loughborough, you know. Keep going. No retirement in sight. So in the spring of 1894, the Foreign Mission Board decided to send Uriah Smith, his son Wilton, and Stephen Haskell on another tour of Europe to attend important meetings and report on the progress of the cause there. On May 16, they boarded the White Star Line steamship named the Majestic, taking berths in second-class cabins. Well, the Smiths dined royally on broiled steak, roast mutton, roast beef, chicken, and fish, and drank gallons of coffee and tea. Haskell struggled to maintain his vegetarian principles. Unfortunately, this often meant that he had only bread, butter, and cheese for each meal. The ships just did not serve a variety of fruits and vegetables in those days. Consequently, when the chef brought out some corned beef, Uriah Smith said that Stephen, quote, could not resist that corned beef, but put into it as though he hadn't had anything to eat for a week. Once or twice after, I believe, they had the same corned beef, and he never refused. Well, what would you feel like after a week of bread and butter and cheese, you know? Maybe cut the poor man some slack. He really was a vegetarian. He tried to live up to that. But it was the same problem that Ellen White faced and our other pioneers when they were on the road, when they were traveling by boat, by train. There wasn't a whole lot on the menu for vegetarians in those days. So if you could, you took food along with you. The problem, of course, is if you took fresh food, it's going to spoil after 2 or 3 days. So that's the problem you face on the road in those days. During their tour of England and Holland, Uriah and his son Wilton took several detours to enjoy scenic and historic sights. But the choleric Haskell declined to see the beautiful Rhine River falls, declaring that it was only some water falling over some rocks. He doesn't go in much for his thanks. On August 8, as the Smiths boarded ship for Turkey and the Middle East, Haskell took another boat for South Africa and from there to Australia. At Melbourne in Victoria, Adventists had opened a Bible training school named Avondale College. Perhaps you've heard of it. It's still going today. In fact, it's more of a university today. Beginning with 25 students, it ran from August 1892 to September 1894. And then Ellen White urged the believers to purchase 1,450 rural acres at Kurumbong. Between 1896 and 99, students and faculty living in tents started erecting the buildings by day and held their classes in the evening. Accepting Ellen White's personal invitation to live with her and her son Willie at Sunnyside, that's the name of Ellen White's house in Australia. You know, some parts of the world, they actually name their houses. That's kind of the practice in England, I know, and you know, Australia was established by the English as well. Sunnyside. Stephen returned to Australia to teach at the new college. As a strong supporter of Mrs. White's educational and health reforms, and now as a guest in her home, Stephen's friendship with Ellen grew even closer in Australia. And one day, in private, Stephen Haskell asked Ellen White to marry him. Ellen White gently turned Elder Haskell down for 12 reasons. First, she did not feel it was best for her to change her last name, which was printed on all her books. Second, she had her son Willie to care for her now until she died. Third, given the challenges in her marriage to James White, she was reluctant to try marriage again. Fourth, she did not wish to place on any husband the many burdens she carried in her prophetic role. Fifth, she did not want to face charges that Stephen Haskell exercised undue influence over her and what she wrote. Of course, Stephen was a very strong-willed person. Sixth, she remembered a few instances in which Haskell's words and actions had hurt her husband James. Seventh, she knew that Haskell could be dictatorial at times. Eight, he had ignored her counsel during the daily controversy, and we will talk about that in just a few moments. The daily part of Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 in the Bible. Ninth, she wanted to be free to travel whenever and wherever God called her to go in her prophetic role, not tied down to a marriage. 10th, she knew that Stephen harbored strong opinions, and she did not want those opinions to influence her writing and her speaking. 11th, she still had a strong affection for the loving memory of James White. Difficult, though their marriage certainly was at times. And 12th, she fervently hoped to be reunited with James on the resurrection day and go to heaven with him. Now, although she refused to marry Stephen Haskell, Ellen had a plan B for his life. Playing the role of Cupid, she suggested to him that Hetty Hurd would make a good life companion for him. She even hinted strongly that this was God's will for him, adding that in a vision she had seen an angel place one hand on Haskell's shoulder and the other hand on Hetty's shoulder, while declaring, "Have I not raised up these two to stand by you?" Now, actually, Stephen had known Hetty Hurd for several years. They had first met in London when Hetty came to England in 1887 as a young Bible worker. Their paths crossed again in South Africa when Doris Robinson and Haskell met with believers in the town of Beaconsfield, and Hetty was a Bible worker in the Cape Town area and the Kimberley diamond mining area. Stephen kind of liked her no-nonsense efficiency and her enthusiasm and drive. Born January 23, 1857 in Jacksonville, Illinois, Hetty had been converted at the age of 8, but when her father died 5 years later, she lost interest in religion. At 27, she had migrated to California, where in 1884 she taught at a large district school at Lemoore for $75 a month. During the summer, she worked in her brother-in-law, William Gray's orchard, and in his vineyard. Once, when she accepted Gray's invitation to attend an Adventist camp meeting at Oakland, she found herself deeply moved by Elder J.N. Loughborough's sermon, The Saint's Inheritance. After taking Bible studies with Elder William Healy, who was an evangelist in California, she was baptized and joined the Lemoore Seventh-day Adventist Church. In May of 1885, Hetty attended one of the first Adventist Bible instructor schools held in San Francisco. Following that, she began a 34-year career as a Bible instructor and trainer in California, then in England, South Africa, and Australia. And so on February 24, 1897, Elder William Baker married Stephen and Hetty in the parlor of his home. Stephen was 64. Hetty was 39. Quite the opposite age ratio that he had shared with his first wife, Mary. Mary had been 38, Stephen had been 17. In truth, Elder Haskell was robbing the cradle, but their marriage would last for 22 years, until her death in 1919. Since they never had any children, however, Anna Rasmussen's suggestion that the Haskells lived a life of social purity, which is an old Victorian phrase, that they had a platonic relationship in their marriage without sexual relations, is probably an accurate description. But truth be told, Ellen White always carried a torch for Stephen Haskell. She wrote more letters to Elder Haskell, 300 of them, than to any other pioneer worker outside of her own immediate family. When she drew up her will in 1901, she left her writings as a perpetual trust to her sons, Willie and Edson, and to Stephen Haskell, whom she felt would do more to protect her prophetic heritage than the General Conference leaders at that time. When she died in 1915 at Elms Haven in California, she was surrounded by photos of her family members and one framed picture of Stephen Haskell on the mantelpiece. They remained the best and the closest of friends until her death in 1915. Although General Conference President Arthur G. Daniels wanted Hetty to go to Adelaide as a Bible instructor, Mrs. White intervened to keep her at Avondale College. Well, Stephen taught a class on the book of Daniel at 6 in the morning. 6 a.m., book of Daniel. Exciting. Some of you aren't even out of bed yet at 6 a.m. I rather think his students were a little bit on the sleepy side. Hetty taught courses in physiology, geography, and a verse-by-verse study of the book of Revelation, which, of course, you and I are going to be doing next quarter, right? Revelation, January, February, March, for our Sabbath school lessons. In addition, she served as the school's matron, which was kind of the term they used for cafeteria director in those days. She soon acquired a reputation for being firm as a rock to principal, an outstanding matron and teacher, and a loving woman who helped everyone she could. When the Haskells purchased a house named Cuniu in Stanmore, a suburb of Sydney, Stephen began a series of evangelistic meetings while Hetty gave Bible studies to 40 converts. In July of 1898, Stephen was elected president of the New South Wales Conference. So the couple moved to Brisbane that fall to engage in camp meetings and tent evangelism. Soon they had 55 converts preparing for baptism. In August, they rented a storefront in Wallsend, New South Wales, to serve as a meeting place and apartments for several of the Bible instructors. But just when things were looking up for them in Australia, the General Conference called them back to America. So they departed on August 5, 1899, taking a ship for San Francisco. No sooner had their feet hit the ground than the Haskells were off on the camp meeting circuit. That fall, they spoke at gatherings in California, Kansas, Nebraska, Illinois, and Michigan. During the winter months in 1900, they also traveled down south to attend educational conventions at Graysville Academy, which today is Southern Adventist University. Later that spring, they visited Oakwood Industrial School, a black institution in Huntsville, Alabama, that opened 4 years before with only 4 teachers and 16 students. In 1896 today, it's huge. It's Oakwood University. It's very, very large indeed. 2,000 or 3,000 students. From there, they took a boat up the Mississippi River to Yazoo City and on up to Vicksburg, where they toured Edson White's mission boat, the Morning Star. And Jim here has some interesting information on the building of the Morning Star at Allerton, not too far from where you're sitting right now. He got a book in a bookstore here in Holland. Then they headed westward to Texas to visit the new industrial school at Keene, which today is Southwestern Adventist University. After 1905, however, Stephen and Hetty would make Nashville, Tennessee, their new home. All of this perambulating seems to portray a relaxed, pleasant life for the Haskells. We must not forget, though, that at times they had to face fanaticism and strong opposition, even within Adventist ranks. You see, during the 1890s, Elder Haskell, like J.N. Loughborough, opposed the false teachings of a self-proclaimed prophetess named Anna Rice. Despite the fact that some church leaders, A.T. Jones, E.J. Wagner, W.W. Prescott, supported her. And J.H. Derland, a Bible teacher at Battle Creek College, actually distributed Annie Rice's testimonies to his students. Very unwise. Once, when Haskell and Prescott were preaching at Walla Walla College, and Prescott was about to share some of Rice's alleged visions with the students there, a letter from Ellen White arrived and stopped him from doing so. Not only did Haskell disagree with Prescott's public sharing of Rice's prophetic views, the two men also differed widely in background and temperament. Prescott was well educated. He had a degree from Princeton. Ever hear that? Yeah, Princeton. Not many of us could get in. He had a degree from Princeton. He was sophisticated. Haskell was a self-made man and unpolished. Prescott was widely viewed as a liberal or progressive. Haskell was seen as a rigid conservative and traditionalist all of his life. The two men would cross swords yet again, 1909, 1910, over the interpretation of the daily in Daniel chapter 8 and chapter 11, when Prescott considered Haskell too narrow-minded and legalistic in his outlook. Haskell saw Prescott as doctrinally unsafe. Another controversy that Stephen and Hetty faced together was the infamous Holy Flesh movement. You heard of that? South of us, across the border in Indiana, the Holy Flesh movement. All right, let me go into some detail here. During the 1890s, many American Christians were caught up in what became known as the holiness movement. The holiness movement often combined things like faith healing, pantheistic thought, unique prophetic interpretations of the Bible, and very noisy emotional worship services. They were designed to bring tearful confessions and conversions. Well, writing to Ellen White, Elder Haskell described how some of these queer doctrines, as he termed them, had infiltrated the Adventist church. Some were teaching that God's seal would never, ever be placed on anyone with gray hair or anyone who had any kind of physical deformity. Others were teaching that believers could reach a state of perfection, both physically and spiritually, so that they would never die. Still others were teaching that because all life is sacred, no insects, including Michigan mosquitoes, no reptiles, including poisonous snakes, should ever be killed. Haskell also felt that Jones and Wagner were carrying their faith healing somewhat to an extreme. Hetty Haskell quoted F.M. Wilcox as declaring, "There are more cranks and strange doctrines to the square foot in Colorado than in any other part of the world." Well, Hetty probably would have substituted Indiana for Colorado, because she actually observed and took notes on the Holy Flesh movement in Indiana. So we have first-hand accounts of what was going on in that conference. During 1900, she and Stephen observed Conference President R.S. Donnell and the conference evangelist S.S. Davis and other church officials leading out in meetings that featured what they called, euphemistically, boisterous worship. I'll let you decide how boisterous is boisterous. Right? This included singing religious words to dance tunes, accompanied by drums, tambourines, bass fiddles, flutes, trumpets, and an organ played very vigorously. They encouraged all the attendees to these meetings to shout, to cry, to faint, to confess their sins publicly, so that they could acquire translating flesh. That's the other phrase for holy flesh, translating flesh, which enabled them to go to heaven without seeing death. The Haskell's letters and oral testimony led General Conference officials to fire Donnell, the president of the conference, and Davis, the secretary and evangelist, and to bring a halt to what many saw as bedlam down there in Indiana. I'm happy to say, as I preach down there in Indiana at their camp meetings and their churches, that those Hoosiers have calmed down quite a bit from those days. I've never seen a meeting that in any remote way comes close to this holy flesh excitement. Haskell also found himself opposing some of Elder Prescott's proposals for organizational changes at the 1901 General Conference session. Like J.N. Loughborough, Haskell had played a key role in the original formation of institutions and conferences in the 1850s and 1860s. And so at first he strongly resisted any efforts, be they by the president, GC President Daniels, or Prescott, or any other, to change what he considered to be a divinely ordained structure. that didn't need to be fixed or altered. Consequently, Stephen at first opposed such progressive steps as forming union conferences and departments. And both of those had already been tried out in Australia and South Africa and had been proven to be workable, efficient, helpful. But after talking with Ellen White and her son Willie, Stephen Haskell changed his mind and was ready to support reorganization in order to bring greater representation and decentralization to the church structure. Yet another controversial issue concerned the Review and Herald Press's new policy of reducing or even eliminating royalties on the books that authors had written. Half a century earlier, James White had actually given 50% of the income from the sale of books and tracts to the writers. 50%. Now, the Review wanted to reduce that to only 10% or less. Haskell, himself a much published writer, I'll bring you half a dozen of his books next time I'm here, quickly took Ellen White's side of that debate, arguing that the labor was worthy of his hire. He complained that the press had even Jewed down, that's his word, Uriah Smith's royalties on thoughts on Daniel and Revelation so drastically that he was only getting a pittance. After the 1901 General Conference session, Mrs. White urged Stephen and Hetty to engage in urban evangelism in some of America's largest cities. You know, for half a century or more, we've been avoiding the cities, right? Rural living, close to nature, stay away from the wickedness of the city. We've been avoiding them, and now Ellen White is saying, but we need to work in the cities. There are souls that need to be saved. And so she impressed upon Stephen and Hetty to pioneer that work. They were both about 70 years old now, but they pioneered this new form of outreach in New York City, in Nashville, in San Bernardino, in Oakland, and in Portland, Oregon, between 1901 and 1912. The Haskell's labors in New York City, for example, produced spectacular results. Working in Manhattan and Brooklyn, among German, Scandinavian, and English-speaking immigrants, they gave Bible studies door to door. They conducted a training school for 20 young workers, and they sold magazines and gave in-home health treatments, shampoos, hot salt and cold baths for $1, $1.50 to make their work largely self-supporting. The Haskells would go knocking door to door. And when people opened the door in New York City, they'd say, is there anything about the Bible that's always puzzled you? Any part of it, any book? Always want to understand more about it. And so they would gear their Bible study to the questions that the people would ask. Probably today you wouldn't even get the door open in New York City. But in those days, 100 years ago, doors would open. And they had Bible studies by the score going. By 1902, they were holding evangelistic meetings at 3 different sites. Unlike the flamboyant New York City evangelist E.E. Franke, who spent hundreds of dollars on advertising and held meetings in Carnegie Hall, the Haskells held meetings in the far cheaper Metropolitan Hall. And they kept their advertising expenses between $6 and $9 a week. But after 15 months in New York City, Stephen's team had won 90 converts at a total cost of only $60. By contrast, Elder Franke's flamboyant showmanship gained him very few converts and eventually led to the loss of his ministerial credentials and his membership in the Adventist Church. That's a very sad story indeed. In addition to their work among the immigrants, Haskell evangelized African Americans in New York City, something that we didn't very often do at this time. And they organized the first Black Adventist church in New York City. In August of 1902. And then in 1906, they went out to California, worked in San Bernardino, alternating health lectures with doctrinal talks. Hetty trained the team of 20 individuals in how to give Bible studies, cooking, and health classes. It left her exhausted. Although not quite 50, for the sake of her health, she clearly needed to find something less stressful, less strenuous to do. The new ministry that would fill her life for the next 18 years was to help Stephen edit a new magazine. It was entitled The Bible Training School, and it was born in New York City in 1902. It soon grew into a 16-page monthly publication. The vast majority of its doctrinal articles were written by only 4 authors: Stephen and Hetty Haskell, Ellen White, and J.N. Loughborough. Its market included mostly Bible instructors, call porters, pastors, and Sabbath school teachers. Every year, this couple produced 6 issues, in addition to several special numbers, often totaling 18 issues. The BTS actually received no denominational funding. So the success of the magazine depended on members buying thousands of copies at 3 cents each, and then selling them to the public at 10 cents apiece. Academy and college students earned scholarships by selling the Bible Training School periodical. After the Haskells left New York City, they published the magazine from South Lancaster in a tiny cottage they used as their home and their office. The last issue appeared in January of 1920, 1 month after Hetty's death in December of 1919, which tells me, at least, that Hetty was the driving force, because Stephen lived on another 3 years, but he did not keep the Bible Training School going. I think that Hetty was probably the leading editor of it. In addition to their publishing efforts, Stephen and Hetty continued hitting the camp meeting trail. Like Ellen White and J.N. Loughborough, they were seen as the Adventist celebrities and the 3 oldest active pioneers in the cause. So no camp meeting was quite complete without at least one of them on the platform. In 1908, for example, they spoke at camp meetings in Lodi and Melrose, California, as well as up in Reno, Nevada. When he was writing his book, The Great Second Advent Movement, Loughborough also interviewed Haskell to gather as many memories of the early pioneer days as he could. In one respect, Stephen's memories of those early days got him into serious trouble between 1904 and 1910 during the heated debate over the meaning of the term the daily. In Daniel 8, verses 11 through 13, and Daniel 11, verse 31. And if you're not sleeping very well at night, I would recommend that you read those 2 chapters and something from the pioneers about the daily. It should put you into a deep sleep very soon, okay? Deep sleep. What I'm about to describe to you sounds to us today like a tempest in a teapot. But for those pioneers at the time, this is life and death stuff. Well, the Millerites, Loughborough, Haskell, and other conservatives, believed that the daily referred to the removal of the daily Jewish sacrifices by Roman paganism. Louis Conradi, Elder Prescott, and other so-called liberals saw the daily as the taking away of Christ's priestly mediation in the heavenly sanctuary by the Roman Catholic papal ecclesiastical structure that set up the Mass. The Catholic Mass being a substitute for Christ's heavenly ministry in the sanctuary above. Because Haskell firmly believed that he was defending a landmark doctrine held by the pioneers, including, he claimed, Ellen White herself, back in the 1840s and 50s. He, like J.N. Loughborough, refused to remain quiet about what seems to us today to be a a tempest in a teapot. Now, even though Mrs. White repeatedly asked Loughborough and Mary and Stephen Haskell to stop agitating this issue, instead, believing they were standing tall in defense of present truth, Stephen, Hetty, and John continued writing articles about the daily in the Bible training school for several years. You see, Prescott was the editor of the Adventist Review and Sabbath Herald. So he wasn't going to publish any of their articles on the daily in his magazine. So they printed them in the Bible training school instead. Well, both Haskell and Loughborough believed firmly in the divine inspiration of Ellen White. Their refusal to heed her admonitions in this matter brought both men personal anguish and embarrassment for several years to come. Indeed, I believe that in part it was Stephen's belief in Ellen White's verbal inspiration that motivated him to stick to his guns. In his mind, he was defending her divine inspiration and authority when he supported the Adventist pioneers' view of the daily against what he saw as William Prescott's new view, which was full of doctrinal error. Adventist scholars Herbert Douglas, George Knight, and Gerald Wheeler agree that Stephen Haskell was a verbal inspiration advocate. He regarded every word from Ellen White's pen, no matter in what form it was written, to be as truly divinely inspired, infallible, and authoritative as the Bible itself. In a letter written on November 4, 1912, W.C. White, the eldest son of Ellen White, warned Stephen Haskell in these words: "I believe that there is a danger of our injuring Mother's work by claiming for it more than she claims for it. More than Father," that's James White, "ever claimed for it. More than Elder Andrews, Wagoner, or Smith ever claimed for it. I cannot see consistency in our putting forth a claim of verbal inspiration when Mother does not make any such claim." That's about as direct as you can get. When Willie showed this letter to his mother, she wrote in the margin, "I approve of the remarks made in this letter." We cannot be certain, however, that Stephen altered his views as a result. Now, when I come back on the 8th, is it? December 8th? We'll look at part 4. 1905 to 1922. We'll learn more about Haskell's books, and if you handle them carefully, I'll have original copies, okay, to show you. His self-supporting work among African Americans in the South. Some of his aberrant views. His efforts in dealing with racial, Sunday law, and prohibition issues. He did not hesitate to throw himself into some very contentious, sticky issues. His relationships with Adventist dissidents, apostates. His and Hetty's health issues, their final days, and what I would call Stephen Haskell's legacy to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So that will be part 4, I believe, December 8th. But since I have not seen you in 6 months, I know you've been storing up some questions here to ask me. So if you will pull those sheets of paper out of your pockets now and refer to those questions. We like to have a little Q&A time. It doesn't have to be about Stephen Haskell at all, but any of those troubling questions on Adventist history that you have here, we'll be happy to discuss them here. Open forum. Yes?
Dr. Strayer, in this week's Sabbath school lesson, Uriah Smith's name was mentioned as being chastised by J. and N.
do you have a date on that? I'd like to know just what time period we're talking about here.
It was in either Sunday or Monday's lesson for this week.
Okay, all right. Some of us down there at Andrews follow the CQ, the Collegiate Quarterly, and so it wasn't in that quarterly, so I did not see that. It's a little bit puzzling at this point to know, since those men lived such long lives, whether this was in the early years of our denomination or toward the